All right. We are in Isaiah 28. I wanted to do a lot more chapters, a lot faster, and I just keep getting caught up in them and not feeling like I can go fast because they're all good. So, let's hear Isaiah 28. Let's hear. Perhaps we could have somebody read verses 1 through 4.
All the proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim, and the fading flower of its glorious beauty, which is on the head of the rich valley of those overcome with wine. Behold, the Lord has one who is mighty and strong, like a storm of hail, a destroying tempest, like a storm of mighty overflowing waters. He casts down to the earth with his hand. The proud crown of drunkards of Ephraim will be trodden underfoot. The fading flower of its glorious beauty, which is on the head of the rich valley, will be like a first ripe fig before the summer. When someone sees it, he swallows it as soon as it is in his hand.
All right, so we're starting out this chapter talking about Ephraim again. You may recall that's one of the tribes of Israel, one of the northern tribes, and that's one of the sort of symbolic names that takes in all of the northern tribes. So we're talking about the northern kingdom here, most likely. The proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim. That, I don't know, the way he puts that. And again, there's a lot of poetry in this little section because he repeats those phrases. You notice that, verse 1 and verse 3. The proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim, and the fading flower of its glorious beauty. He repeats both of those phrases later on. It's like at first he's calling your attention to it, and then he tells you what's going to happen to it. All of Israel's glory, the northern kingdom we're talking about here, all of their glory and beauty is going to be swallowed up in an instant, even though it often seems like they're, very successful. It's a proud crown. It's, they have glorious beauty. They feel like they stand out. This country, this northern kingdom that formed after the breakup of the two parts of Israel after Solomon, the northern kingdom feels like they're kind of on top of the world right now. They've managed to, politically make their way through the morass of problems in the area. Remember that they're the ones who are directly facing up against, in the northern part of Israel here, they're the ones directly up against Syria, Aram, and the Assyrians, which is more past Syria here. They're the first place that all these people march through on their way down south to Judah and then to Egypt. And remember, Assyria and Egypt are the two big powers fighting at this particular stage. Babylon is still rising. So, but, when the northern kingdom, they kind of feel like, they've made their way through this. And other things that we've found in ancient history indicate, I've mentioned this before, that the biblical record only tells us what we need to know. It doesn't necessarily give us every single detail of what's going on there. They may have been relatively independent, but that could have been because they were paying tribute to Assyria the whole time. They may have been a vassal state of Assyria just to get by. So they're sending, most likely, tribute to Assyria to buy off an invasion. So they're feeling pretty good about themselves, though, because they made it. And maybe, they've most likely done this by, hedging their bets, making side deals with other countries, misrepresenting their wealth, all the things that countries do now, to be honest, to get away with, to survive and to try to get out with as much of the riches as you can. They're doing pretty well. In fact, when you read, like, 1 Kings going into 2 Kings, you sort of get the impression that oftentimes it's like the northern kingdom is doing a little bit better than the southern kingdom. Not as far as God is concerned. God, his eye is far more on Judah, because of David's lineage and because, that's the center of his worship in Jerusalem in the southern kingdom in Judah. Israel is the one who broke away, and the very first king of Israel realized right away, we can't have everybody going to Jerusalem to worship all the time since that's out of the country. That's my rival now. So he goes ahead and sets up some very convenient places of worship with their own little golden calves at Dan in the far north, and then at Bethel, which is the farthest south point of the northern kingdom. So, you got these nice centrally located areas, so you don't have to cross the border. You don't have to take tribute to Judah. You don't have to pay tithes at the temple. Don't let the riches leave the country. Leave them here. We'll set up priests. We'll have altars. We'll have sacrifices. And odds are, remember the Levites. Well, maybe, I don't know if we've talked about this. Remember, Levites don't actually live in Jerusalem. I mean, there's probably a few who do, but for the most part, the Levites are scattered across the whole land. They don't have land of their own. They live in the cities that are throughout the entire kingdom, both kingdoms. And so the Levites who are up north, they've got to do their duties at the temple, which is set up in a certain order. Solomon set up orders for them, and sort of a calendar by which they would know, okay, these families come down and serve these few weeks, and then those families come down those few weeks. And that order lasted all the way into Jesus' time, because we actually have information on John the Baptist's father and when he was supposed to serve. Hi. Anyway, point is that we have Levites all throughout the northern kingdom, and a lot of the Levites and priests who lived in the northern kingdom, we don't think kept going to Jerusalem. We think that they switched sides and started serving at the golden calves. It's weird that these people it's like, do you not know your history, or are you purposefully repeating it? Because, golden calf, we as Christians, when we hear golden calf, what do you think of? It's not a high point of Israel's history, right? Yeah. When you think of golden calf, you think of Mount Sinai, you think of Moses, you think of him coming down with tablets and seeing the Israelites having this huge party, and he was only gone a month, and he gets all angry and he breaks the tablets, and, all this terrible stuff happens. And it's really funny and kind of ironic that that's the moment where the Levites are cemented as the tribe that belongs to the Lord. Because it's the Levites, Moses' and Aaron's family, who gather around and say they're the ones who didn't fall into this thing. Aaron made the calf, oddly enough, but yeah, isn't that weird? Yeah. See, the Lord can redeem anybody. It doesn't really, doesn't really matter what you've done in the past, clearly. But anyway, the Levites are the ones who gathered behind Moses and said, we didn't worship the calf, we'll stand with you. And they're the ones that God uses to judge everybody else. And in that moment, he says, the Levites belong to me, they're my tribe now. They don't have an inheritance in the land, I'm their inheritance. And that's where he establishes them as the temple tribe from then on. But it's kind of funny that it's the golden calf that established the Levites, but a lot of the Levites in the northern kingdom probably went over and started serving at the golden calves of Israel. This is all hundreds of years in the past of Isaiah, actually. This is just building up to this, but Israel feels like they've got it going pretty good. They look like they're doing better than the southern kingdom, than Judah. They're probably wealthier. They certainly have more people, more land, more resources. There's a lot more trade passing through them. They're closer to Tyre and Sidon, which is where your ports are for the entire Mediterranean. They've got all sorts of advantages, and they're doing well. It seems like, like in the stories of Ahab and Jehoshaphat, Ahab being the northern king, Jehoshaphat being the king in Judah, it's sort of always Ahab, grandly reaching out and saying, hey, Jehoshaphat, you want to go up to war with me? Hey, you want to join with me on this thing? Ahab's kind of the older, he's the big guy in the partnership. And that seems to be how the Northern Kingdom ran for a long time. So, they're feeling pretty good about themselves. It's their crown of glory. And they're drunk on their own apparent success. That's what's happening. And the Lord basically promises that he's going to swallow it up in an instant. The Lord is mighty and strong, verse 2, like a storm of hail, a destroying tempest. He says in verse 3 that their proud crown will be trodden underfoot, and the fading flower of its glorious beauty, which is on the head of the rich valley, will be like a first ripe fig before the summer. When someone sees it, he swallows it as soon as it is in his hand. You know, it's like you're walking along, and it's the very first ripe fruit in your orchard, and you're like, you know, I'm not going to wait for this. I'm going to enjoy this for a moment before harvest time. And you just take it and eat it, and it's wonderful. And he says that's how the northern kingdom is going to be to their oppressors. Whoever comes in is going to pluck them that quickly and destroy them that completely. It'll be like it never existed. Verses 5 and 6, if somebody could read that.
And that day the Lord of hosts will be for a crown of glory and a diadem of beauty to the remnant of his people, for a spirit of justice to him who sits in judgment, and for strength to those who turn back the battle at the gate.
Yeah. So the Lord of hosts, Yahweh of armies, he says he's the real crown and diadem. This Hebrew word is only used here in the entire Old Testament to mean diadem. It's used in 2 other places to mean something else entirely, but it's like, I mean, he really, really wanted to make a point. You know, he should be the crown of glory for his people, not, you know, their apparent success. And he says, you know, a spirit of justice to him who sits in judgment, and strength to those who turn back the battle at the gate. So the remnant, and we're not probably even talking about the northern kingdom at all at this point, but he's going to strengthen the ones who hold fast to him. Verses 7 and 8, perhaps, if somebody wants to read those.
These also reel with wine and stagger with strong drink. The priest and the prophet reel with strong drink. They are swallowed by wine, they stagger with strong drink, they reel in vision, they stumble in living judgment. For all tables are full of filthy vomit, with no space left.
Ew. Yeah. Not a nice picture.
I relish reading that.
Yeah, after I asked somebody to read it, I looked down and I'm like, oh, I feel bad for the person who picks that one up. Yeah, so the priests and the prophets, they're drunk on their own success. And the result is they're unable to see the future. They're unable to judge well. They can't perform their functions at all. They still claim to be able to, but they're not doing it. They don't have anything to give their people spiritually but filth and vomit. You know, you came to the banquet, and that was what was all over the table. It was not a great meal. It was, ew. It was sick. And that's what they're offering the people. And the people are just lapping it up, basically, and they don't even know it. I mean, this is how messed up these people are. You know, they're like animals. They're like dogs, who will also eat gross stuff. That's what Israel has turned to. And they're glorying in it. They think this is good. They think that they're doing really well. You know, if you ask them, they'll be like, oh, the Lord's blessing us. Yeah, you know, Yahweh's on our side. And any other gods we line up, they're all on our side too. We're in good shape. We are making it. And the priests and the prophets go, yes, you are. Remember, Ahab had hundreds of prophets who would tell him all the time. And Ahab, again, is long before Isaiah, but it's a good picture of what the northern kings were like. You know, Ahab had hundreds of prophets who were like, go up, Yahweh's on your side. Do it, you can do it, man. God is pleased with you, and Jezebel, your Canaanite princess. Go team, you know. Yeah. You know, and only, you know, Elijah and Elisha are the only people who ever stand against them. So that's how bad things are. And since they failed to instruct their people don't know anything. They're like children. And that's where we're getting to in verses 9 through 11, if somebody wants to read that.
To whom will he teach knowledge, and to whom will he explain the message? Those who are weaned from the milk, those taken from the breast. For it is precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line upon line, here a little, there a little. For by people of strange lips and with a foreign tongue, the Lord will speak to this people.
And I realized we cut it off halfway through the sentence, but I did that on purpose. So, this has always been, this is one of those verses that every commentator kind of has a different opinion on, and so do I. So, we'll try and fit it into the context. We'll try to understand what's being said here. So remember, the people who are supposed to be teaching these people, the people who are supposed to be guiding and leading them, the kings, the priests, the prophets, none of them are doing their job. It's just a huge mess, and they're completely, again, it's the opposite of nutrition. It's the opposite of growth for these people. And so they are children who have not learned. And so the Lord asks, verses 9 and 10 sound like they're more of a saying that somebody else would say. To whom will he teach knowledge? To whom will he explain the message? Who's left who can even hear any of this stuff? To the babies, these babies we're talking about, those weaned from the milk, taken from the breast. And then we get to verse 10, verse 10's got layers. It's kind of hard to follow. And I actually put it up here in Hebrew. So, it's a bunch of very small words. It's baby talk. It's stammering syllables, just little, very short things. Ki tzav letzav, tzav letzav. That means for it is precept on precept, precept on precept. And this rhymes, which is unusual in Hebrew. Kav lakav, kav lakav. Line on line, line on line. Zair shom, zair shom. Literally, that's a little there and a little there. Idiomatically, it means more like a little here, a little there. It's sort of like you're pointing to two different places. A little here, a little there. So there's two levels to this, almost certainly. One is the actual meaning of the words. We don't want to get away from that ever. And that appears to be the best translation we can get on this. There's other opinions, but I would say the majority of people who translate are lined up on this being, precept on precept, or maybe, idea on idea, commandment on commandment. These are all things that are, this is the way, first of all, this is the way that you would teach a child. There's a lot of educational theories running around out there, but one of the more common ones over the years has been that you start out with more facts you can memorize, and then you build up to concepts and ideas, and you start to apply the knowledge that you memorize as a child. We memorize multiplication tables, and later on we understand what they mean and how to apply them, how to actually use them. But that first couple of weeks when you're memorizing multiplication tables as a kid, you're just like, 7 times 7 is 49, 7 times 8 is 56, and you're like, why? Why did you do this to me?
So many years later, you will appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. That's what I tell people. My kids still don't believe me, but yeah. There's reasons for this stuff. There's reasons why you memorized addition and multiplication tables. That it enables the entire realm of arithmetic. Once you've got that, you've got everything. You've got the building blocks. But you got to start with these very simple facts, and you just have to learn them. How can you understand geography if you don't have, a general list of places in your head? How do you know? We learn states and capitals at some point. We learn maybe the countries of a continent. We learn the continents of the world. Everything has, precepts, and we build on those precepts. But we have to, we build them in layers, right? And that's what this is saying. But it's funny that he's saying this in a very sing-songy way. It's unusual in Hebrew to have something that just ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Rhythm is the big thing in Hebrew poetry. It's very much about rhythm, and it's very much about lyrical content and how you parallel things or you oppose them. When you go through Psalms and Proverbs and, really study them, it's a very different kind of poetry than we're used to in the West. But it's got its own beauty in it. I mean, you can see the way God used it because He loves the interplay, I should say, of of taking two things and contrasting them, or taking two things and putting them together and saying there's this and then there's this, and going from lesser to greater and greater to lesser. And that's normal for Hebrew poetry. This is abnormal. This, again, is more like what you do with a kid. It wouldn't surprise me if this was an actual sort of a, learning nursery rhyme, kind of like learning your ABCs, your addition facts when you're a child. It wouldn't surprise me if this is where they started kids, but we have no evidence of that. This is pure conjecture on my part. But it wouldn't surprise me if, when kids are like, why do we have to learn this? Because, of course, one of their classes, so to speak, one of their early lessons from their mothers and fathers would have been the commandments. What's important to a Jewish child, or what's important to an Israelite child of the Old Testament? What does God require? What are the commandments? What is the law? That's going to be as important as anything. The Jews count 613 separate commandments in Genesis through Deuteronomy. I don't know if that's really a valid way to count them. They kind of fudge around. Everybody's got a different list, but still, it's definitely several hundred. And and you think, oh, I thought it was just 10. No, those are just the overarching ones, and then it plays itself out for the Jewish people in various ways, and a lot of those, would only apply to the Jewish people ever. When you get rules like, you have to put fringes on the end of your garment, don't mix wool and cotton, or wool and linen, I should say. Strange little things like that we kind of look at and go, okay, what's the big deal there? How exactly to determine whether or not you can eat an animal? Are the hooves divided? Does it, is it ruminant? Things like that, and you're just like, what? Anyway, but to understand any of this stuff and to really grasp who the God is who gave them this law, you got to start with the basics. You just got to start with the laws themselves. Precept on precept, line on line. You start with, learn the commandments, and then you can learn about the God who gave you the commandments. It's funny because the New Testament kind of runs along this same line. It says that the law is a schoolmaster. The law isn't the be-all, end-all. It's just the foundation. You pretty much have to have the law to have the gospel. You have to have the bad news to have the good news. Right? I mean, the good news is that Jesus can take your sin away. But if you don't believe that you have sin, if you don't know what sin is, if you've never been convicted of that in any way internally, then that's meaningless. I mean, you can parrot it. I did it for years. I spent half my life thinking I was a Christian and never really internalizing the fact that I was sinful. And I could parrot all this stuff back then. As a teenager, I could, read off to you 3 or 4 different, evangelistic systems that walked you through the gospel and I never really said to myself, oh, this is about you. This is about, your sin. So the Lord still has to work as well. But anyway, you got to start with the law and understand the character of God. Maybe start to understand the holiness of God, and then you really start getting into the issue of God being holy and you not being holy, and you not being able to stand before Him, not able to have a relationship with Him, Him not being able to forgive you or save you or do anything for you unless the initial problem is resolved between you, the sin. Then, you can start thinking about, okay, what can take away my sin? And we all know the hymn's answer to that, right? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Anyway, so the other thing about this is that, again, this is very halting, guttural sort of talk here. Kav lakav, kav lakav, zayir shom, tzav latzav, tzav latzav. It's just, again, it doesn't even fit the way he's been talking up to this point. The whole rest of the book, the whole rest of the Old Testament doesn't read like this for the most part. And it's funny because now the Assyrians, who are going to destroy Israel, they speak a language that is kind of similar to Hebrew. At this point, pretty much the entire ancient Near East, their language of commerce and their common language is the beginnings of what we would call Aramaic. And Aramaic is very similar to Hebrew. I mean, if you can read Hebrew, you can probably understand Aramaic. You may not be able to speak it, but you could muddle through it. It's not easy, and some of the words are different, but for the most part, you're like, oh yeah, I recognize that. You know, I kind of get that. But it's an ugly language comparatively, especially at that period. I mean, Aramaic developed on its own over time. But yeah, back in that day, Aramaic, the original Semitic mishmash language of the entire Middle East, that's the language that that was the only way the Assyrians could really talk to the people they conquered. And so that's what they used as they moved in. And everybody could speak Aramaic. And that was true all the way up to the point where Alexander marched through this whole area and brought with him Greek culture and made Greek the language of the entire ancient Near East and the Mediterranean area as well. And that's why Greek is what the New Testament's all about. There are portions of your Hebrew Bible that aren't in Hebrew. They're in Aramaic. There's a couple of chapters in Ezra, if I remember correctly, and there's a chapter in Daniel that are basically just copies of letters that were sent out from the government, and they're in Aramaic, interestingly enough. It's a totally different language.
What do the Orthodox Jews think of that?
Oh, they're fine with it. Aramaic is part of what, a rabbi would have to learn Aramaic because, a properly trained, schooled rabbi would have to learn Aramaic because some of their commentaries are only in Aramaic. They frequently use what are called the Targums, that's the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew to Aramaic, which had its own nuances. So they used these Targums to understand. After the exile, gradually the standard language that everybody learned was Aramaic and not Hebrew. You learned Hebrew for school. You learned Hebrew for synagogue. And so that men could stand up and read the Torah on Saturday mornings in synagogue. That's why you learned Hebrew. Aramaic became more and more the normal everyday language. The odds are, it's crazy to think this, but all these people in the New Testament were probably trilingual at least. They had to be. They're speaking Hebrew for synagogue. They're speaking Greek because that's the language of commerce of the day, and that's the language the Romans talked to them in. And they're speaking Aramaic because that had become the standard local language in certainly the Galilee. You look at Peter, who just seems like a dumb fisherman half the time, and you don't think about the fact that he spoke 3 languages, almost certainly. It's kind of weird. Anyway. And not Latin, which is weird for the first pope. Oh, wait, never mind. All right, so, wow, we're running out of time. All right, so the Assyrians spoke this terrible mishmash of Aramaic, and this is an early Aramaic. It's still a pidgin language, basically, and they're swooping in here, and this is how they're talking to the people they're taking over. And that is why I think it says in verse 11, "For by people of strange lips and with a foreign tongue, the Lord will speak to this people." Now, this passage almost certainly has at least one other fulfillment, which would be, I think it's mentioned in the New Testament, and boy, I didn't write that in my notes. I didn't, though. I don't know. I think this is called out in the New Testament at some point. But anyway, 1 Corinthians, thank you. Okay, yeah, that makes sense, yeah. Yeah, so, it's going to become... It's going to have more meaning than just this, but at this point, we're just talking about the local meaning of this in context here. These people are coming in. They're speaking this awful, guttural, monosyllabic baby talk. They're basically grunting at the Israelites as they conquer them and take them away. Verses 12 through 13. I'll go ahead and read these. So he'll speak to this people to whom he has said, "This is rest, give rest to the weary, and this is repose," yet they would not hear. And the word of the Lord will be to them, precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little, that they may go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken. So the Lord wanted them to enter his rest, and they refused. They saw his law instead as a series of commandments that are not important in themselves. You remember? Because again, we're starting with the basics, which is, here's the law of God. Here's what you must do to obey him. It's the basics. And you build from there to understand the character of God and how to have a relationship with him. Yes?
I just thought about that word called phylacteries or whatever.
Phylacteries, the
Phylacteries,
boxes, yeah. Uh-huh.
And is that something that, I mean, they write in those little boxes,
Mhm.
scripture.
Yeah, that's in Deuteronomy, actually. It says, well, it literally says, to bind the words of this law on your forehead and on your arm. And so they read that quite literally and said, okay, well, that's what I'm going to do. And I don't entirely know if the Lord meant for them to take that hyper literally. There's a part of me that says that's so symbolic. You bind them on your forehead, that means you think about them. You bind them on your hand, that means you do them. There's a part of me that really leans toward that. And yet God, Jesus never says you shouldn't have phylacteries. What he railed on the Pharisees was that they made them big so everybody could see them. These people are wearing shoe boxes on their head, showing off their righteousness. That's what the Pharisees were doing. They widened their phylacteries so that everybody knows, I've got the whole Word of God on my arm, and,
Kind of crazy.
it would, yes, but for them, it means they're holy. They obey, they don't just obey, they obey times two. They got big boxes. When they bind it on their doorposts, it's called the mezuzah, and a Jewish household has a mezuzah on their doorpost, a little box with a scroll inside it, and they usually, they kiss it as they walk in through the door to bless the house, because the law says bind it on your doorposts. I'm sure that the Pharisees probably had barber poles outside their houses with, big, here it is, here's the scroll, seriously, that's what the Pharisees are like. Because they're all about men. They want the praise of men. They want men to see how righteous they are. And they don't particularly care whether or not they're really in God's good graces or not. So, but anyway, they saw these commandments as just being these meaningless things that don't, why should we bother? Why should we do this stuff? So they faltered on the simplest thing. They didn't see the commandments as being important. The precepts, the lines, the simple instructions that begin your steps toward understanding who God is. They didn't see any of that as important, so they backed away from his word and fell into the trap. And now that's kind of a warning for us now, really. Because, we should talk about grace all the time because, the gospel is like the most important thing in the world, literally. It's the best news we have. But, to properly give the gospel, to properly understand the gospel, to know what the good news is, you got to know what the bad news is. That means we live holy lives and we talk about our holy God and what he requires. We do not pretend that we are better than other people in and of ourselves. We don't walk around, we're not Pharisees. We don't walk around with the shoe boxes on our head. Or our version of it, big cross necklaces. Or, well, I can't take that shift. It's on a Sunday morning and I don't work on Sundays. Make sure that everybody knows, that's Pharisaic. But it's not Pharisaic just take a stand on that and say, I'd really rather not take that shift because, if you go to church, there's, what are you doing it for? God cares about motivation. God cares about your heart, why you're doing it. And, we will stick out naturally just by being Christians. When you've got to stand there and, at some point it's going to happen where, you're going to be faced with someone who is obviously a dude and who obviously refuses to be called by the pronoun you use for a dude.
And what's that?
I'm she, I'm her, I'm a woman.
Oh, we can't say that anymore.
Well, yeah, you can't say that anymore. And you want to look at this guy and go, no, you're not.
I don't know.
Okay,
There's
your
so-
Adam's back apple is bigger than I am. Your 5 o'clock shadow is longer than mine is. Your voice is deeper than mine. There's no question. Okay.
Well, we gotta wear those things. The women have to wear those, the,
Like a hijab? Is that what you're talking about?
yeah, something like that. Like they wear, in the, well, probably they wear them in Iraq. I don't know. And,
Okay.
they
I
don't,
was thinking more about the whole LGBTQ thing, but
oh,
that's where I was going with this. I wasn't going with Muslim thing, but I mean that's a possibility too.
well,
I
Muslims
mean,
don't like those people.
huh?
Muslims don't like these
Well, no, they don't. It's funny, yeah, and they can get away with not being cool with that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they
It's part of their
can.
religion.
Yeah,
Don't talk
yeah,
about that.
yeah, and
Don't
because
put their
because they're not
together.
Christians, we need to kind of pussyfoot around that. But we being Christians, we have to kowtow.
They
Yeah,
don't say it's sin.
huh?
The Muslims won't say that it's sin.
They'll kill them, and they won't bury them. But
Yeah.
I'm 20 of my tower at a time.
But it's not sinful. Don't point it out as sin.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and for us to be faced with something like this and say, first of all, you are not a woman, you're a man, and I can't possibly, there's a point to it. I'm just lying if I say anything else. And secondly, when they tell you that you have to, it's funny how, now we hear about things like pride parades, and we know what that means now, right? That has nothing, it's not pride in a biblical sense. It's not pride in any good connotation. It is specifically pride that it's okay, for these people to shake their fists at God and say, I am the opposite of what you made me to be, and I will do that, and I will be that, and I don't care. And they're proud of that, and you have to participate in that if you are, maybe if you're part of a company or part of a group or whatever that's going to be doing this pride thing. Eventually, this is going to become a thing for all of us. I mean, we're on the verge of it now.
It's just that we live here in the Midwest where it's a little more.
Yeah, we're getting away with it still out here. It would be tougher on the coasts, but eventually it's going to be enforced upon us. You participate in Pride, in our Pride thing, our Pride week, our Pride event, or whatever, and we're going to say, I'm going to take a sick day that day, and you better bring a doctor's appointment.
You
Well,
mean
you
at
better
work they're
bring a
gonna-
doctor's note. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, eventually we're not going to be able to Daniel our way out of these things. We're going to have to just be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and be like, well, you can throw me in the furnace if you want, but I'm still not going to go along with this. And remember what they said before going in. They said, they said our God might be able to save us, might save us, not might be able to, might save us, but even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow. And the fact is, it's more likely that we'll burn than that there'll be a fourth, like a son of the gods, with us in the furnace, right? I mean, let's be honest. So, anyway, we're walking into this thing now, and I don't know. Point is,
We're being minimalized. That minimalized.
yeah, I guess so. Yeah. I don't know. That's the thing. I think real Christians have always been that way, though. We're not going to win the culture war. At best, we're going to win our survival at any given time, but we're not going to win the culture wars. We're not going to take over the world
I don't
for.
want to suffer, though. I really don't want to suffer a lot, but
Well, that's fine. Pray that you don't.
Yeah.
And the Lord. I mean, He. Remember what Jesus told the daughters of Jerusalem. He didn't say stay and fight. He said flee. He said, he told them on the Olivet Discourse, when you see these times coming, flee to the mountains, get away. When you see this coming, get away. This has been, the Jews have done it for years, and the Christians are going to have to learn how. And in some places they have. Sometimes, when you can't take the heat anymore, you don't have to stay and get martyred. You can run away. What you can't do is deny him. What you can't do is stand up and convert. or even pretend to convert. You can't deny him to other people, because he said if you do that, he'll deny you before his Father in heaven. You know, that is the one requirement. But you can run. You know, and we've been promised persecution. We've been promised trials and tribulation, and we will be vindicated. In the end, we will look back and all of this will have been worth it. The most terrible times in our lives that we suffered for Jesus' sake, we are going to be on the thrones with him, and we are going to be sharing his glory and reflecting it back on him. We'll be vindicated. We'll be ruling the world with him, and Jesus will, you know, he is going to judge everybody who did that to us, who didn't themselves repent and join us. So, you know, it'll all work out in the end, but you gotta take the long view. But you can run. You don't have to suffer. You know, I don't know where you'd run to, but I'm told that there are places where, you know, you can get further and further away. I don't know, I was reading about some little city in Kansas that I guess got taken over by the Society of St. Pius X. You know, they're the ultra-conservative Catholics. Yeah, they still have Latin masses and all that stuff, and they basically moved in en masse, took over the town, and, you know, and they're just running it entirely differently. The public school is almost empty now. Everybody goes to the Catholic school. They're building a big church. You know, they are running the place, running the politics. It actually kind of sounds like a great place to live, except that it's all Roman Catholic, and you probably couldn't, you know, build a church there, you know, a real church to save your life. But, you know, it's funny, because it's like you read that, and you're just like, you know, I don't know, for the time being, you know, we still even have that option, maybe. But what they call the Benedict option now. I don't know how I feel about that stuff. Read that book if you're curious about what I'm talking about. I'm not going to get into it right now. Anyway, all right, we've gone far afield, and it's 10:20, and we only got halfway through the chapter. Of course we did. Of course we did. Be thinking about whether or not you want me to just go faster or take 2 non-consecutive years to finish this, because we're going to have to make a decision on that pretty soon.
Probably be the better option.
I would rather do 2 non-consecutive years and just go at the right pace and finish this right, personally. But you know, if anybody feels more strongly about it, if you guys are sick of Isaiah, you're like, if I hear the word Northern Kingdom one more time, I'm gonna, you know, if you know, let me know if it's getting to you, and maybe we'll take a break in between. I don't know, you know, and of course you will have the year's break when I take off next year and Dennis takes over again. So, if he does, I assume that's been the case, but you know, we'll see. Anyway, all right. Any thoughts on this section? There was a lot here, and I'm sorry. All right. Well, let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we pray that you will not allow us to disdain your word and your commandments. Lord, if we love you, you said that we would obey your commandments. So I pray that you will give us the strength to obey, Lord, and the strength to live holy lives, not because it ingratiates us with you, not because it atones for your wrath against our sin. That already happened. But purely because we love you and we want to do what you want us to do. And because we want the better relationship and we want the better lives and we want to live wise, happy, godly, productive, fulfilling lives, glorifying your Son at every turn. So teach us obedience so we can do that. In Jesus' name, amen.